Good morning, everyone. We will get started shortly as the room is filled with attendees momentarily. Good morning, everyone. We will begin in just a moment. We ask you to please use the Zoom chat option to let us know which county you're joining us from so we can get a better feel of who our audiences are today, right? So Central Florida, South Florida, North Florida regions. I'm seeing them popping up now. Palm Beach
Wow,
County, Marion County.
we're all over the place.
We are. Volusia, Broward, Pasco County, Master Gardner, Bellevue, Marion. Oh, we have quite a variety of folks here this
Where's the
morning.
panhandle?
I haven't seen any panhandle representation just yet. Oh, Okaloosa's here.
Leon,
Okaloosa's here.
Okaloosa,
Leon County's
yay.
here.
Santa Rosa, yep. Okay, panhandle's represented.
Yep. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. As you are joining, we are just asking you to please use the chat feature and let us know which county you're joining us from this morning so we can have a better understanding of who our audiences are for this webinar session. We have a lot of representation, quite a few representation from Marion County and Hillsborough, and now Orange County. It's good. Well, very well. Please continue to let us know which county you're joining us from in the chat box below, and we will begin in just a moment. We're just going to give everyone maybe another minute or two to join.
Louisiana.
Oh, this is a new one for us.
Oh, Louisiana again.
Lee County. It's great that Louisiana's able to join us today. Professional audience. Okay, we will begin in maybe another minute or so. In the meantime, please utilize the chat option to let us know which county you're joining us from if you haven't already done so. Okay, Jim was born in Louisiana, but I'm not sure if he still lives there. Very well. Escambia County. Here's our third panhandle representation. Very well. So with that being said, we are nearly 200 participants strong for this morning's webinar. At the last check, I saw we were at 187 participants present today. For the sake of everyone's time, we will begin this webinar. Good morning again and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. My name is Mark Celestin and I am the training coordinator for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. We are excited to host you this morning. Your microphones have been muted. We will be closing the chat feature during the presentation. Please put your questions into the Q&A box and we will take them at the end of the presentation. So once the webinar starts, you will no longer have access to the chat option that you have access to currently. This webinar is approved for 1 FFLCP, LIAF, FDAX, DBPR, FNGLA, and 1 ISA CEU. There is a $15 administration fee to receive a certificate for continuing education. We will put a link to that in the chat box to make payment for the certificate if you have not already done so. You'll also see survey invitation pop up. Please take a moment to complete it. It's an important tool that helps us shape future educational programs and better serve upcoming audiences. We will submit CEUs to the licensing agencies on Friday. So please make sure to finalize your CEU payments by the end of day today if you would like CEU credits for your attendance today. This is part of a monthly webinar series that is held on the second Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Our next regularly scheduled webinar will be September 9th with Andrew Kosher, who will present on the topic, What's New in Tree Selection and Care? But today, we have a different focus. We're thrilled to have you join us today for our webinar on the topic of wildflowers and weeds, exploring nativeness, presented by Mark Frank. Just a little background with our presenter today. Mark Frank is a lifelong plant enthusiast who completed Florida Master Gardener training in Alachua County in 2002 and earned a master's in science in horticulture science from the University of Florida in 2005. He has worked as manager of the nursery at the Singapore Botanic Garden and as a botanist at the Florida Department of Agriculture. Currently, he is the assistant collection manager and extension botanist at the University of Florida Herbarium, the botany collection at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Mark also manages the Herbarium's Plant Identification and Information Services, which serves UF IFAS research and extension personnel, UF faculty, and other clients throughout the state of Florida. He has a particular interest in horticulture taxonomy, the identification and classification of cultivated plants. Without further ado, I present to you Mr. Mark Frank.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I was thrilled to see that we've got over 200 participants for this webinar, so a wonderful turnout. And I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me today. What we're going to do today is explore this concept of nativeness. So what are some definitions for the term native with reference to plants? How do botanists determine if a particular plant species is native to Florida? We're going to look at some examples of recent status changes where a certain species may have originally been considered native and is now considered non-native or vice versa. And then we're going to look at some things to consider when purchasing landscaping with Florida native plants, or particularly when using them in restoration projects. Let me just say that as Mark mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will deal with the questions at the end of the presentation, but if there is something that I say that is really not clear, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A so that Mark can interrupt me during the presentation to clarify. So there was an article that came out in 2020 put together by a group of professionals on the UF IFAS Invasive Species Council. And they published an article in the Journal of Extension that provided concise definitions for 7 different terms used in discussing invasive species. And the purpose behind that publication was to facilitate unified messaging amongst all the extension professionals in UF IFAS and their stakeholders, which is you guys. And so the definition that publication, that working group came up with for native is that it's a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. Now, what we often hear commonly used in Florida and in North America as a whole is that plants are considered as being native if they were present at the time of European contact and settlement. But I find that definition to be fairly problematic for a couple different reasons. One of those reasons is that if we look at European settlement in North America, the earliest settlement in North America was actually the Norse in Newfoundland around 1021 AD. And then the Spanish down in Florida in St. Augustine at 1565 AD. That's a 500-year time period. So which do we use as the point of contact for North America? 10,000 or, 1,000 AD or 1500 AD? And then, of course, this definition of being present at the time of European contact and settlement wouldn't really help if you're talking about whether a plant's native in Europe or not, or when you're talking about different continents where colonization happened on a different time frame. So what I really like as a more nuanced definition is something that was put together by the Federal Native Plant Conservation Committee, which was a cooperative committee between several different federal agencies that manage plants, including the Bureau of Land Management, the Smithsonian, a number of different agencies. And so the definition that they came up with for a native plant is a species that occurs naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, and habitat without direct or indirect human actions. So what I like about this definition is that it's indicating that a native species has evolved and adapted to a specific location or ecosystem over a prolonged period of time, and that there hasn't been human involvement, that it's remained genetically unaltered by humans. So the term native, like the term invasive, is most effectively communicated with a geographic point of reference, because every plant is native to somewhere. So if you just say in reference to a certain plant, oh, it's native, well, of course it's native because every plant comes from some point of origin. So it's better to be more specific and say, okay, this species is native to Eastern North America or the Southeast or Florida or Alachua County. Just remember that those geographic points of reference are a convenience factor, but plants don't really pay attention to geographic borders. Plants are actually confined by ecosystems and habitat conditions. So a plant doesn't care if it's in North Florida or South Georgia, it's occurring in a particular set of habitat conditions. So it's really a convenience to say a geographic point of reference. And for me personally, I have modified the way I communicate about plant species so that now when I'm responding to my clientele, I'll often find myself saying, okay, this is a species that's native to sandhill environments in the coastal plain of the Southeast. Okay, so there's been an interesting series of articles that have come out from a botanist and horticulturist who's at the University of Minnesota named Neil Anderson. And he has suggested that the terms native and non-native or exotic are really value-laden, so that we assume that everything that's native is good and everything that's not native is bad or potentially invasive, and that these assumptions can limit our capacity to control and regulate bad species. And using a specific example of a grass in the Midwest called reed canary grass, which is thought to be native to that area, but it behaves very aggressively in a number of human-modified landscapes. So Anderson suggests that we view each plant species independently of the labels native or non-native. So we really are looking at the specifics of how it reproduces, how it behaves in the wild, and particularly how it behaves in human-modified landscapes, so we can better evaluate both the benefits and potential threats of that species. Now, I should point out that Anderson's idea that it's possible for a species to be both native and invasive is really contrary to most governmental or regulatory definitions. So when you look at government or, say, for example, the FDAC's DPI definitions for a native plant or an invasive plant, they would say an invasive plant by definition is something that's not native. So this is a fairly contentious point that Anderson has introduced. But I would argue that the idea behind it is valid, that perhaps we do make some assumptions about the inherent good or benefit of native species relative to non-native species. And particularly when it comes to evaluating things like ecosystem services, that we may see some bias in the research, immediately assuming that native species have more benefit in terms of pollinators or removing contaminants from the soil or hydrology or food for wildlife and so on. And so I think it's good that Anderson and his colleagues have reminded us just to be aware of these potential biases. Okay, so enough of the definitions. If you, as a professional, encounter a plant in Florida and you're not sure if it's native or not, the best resource you can use to check is called the Atlas of Florida Plants. This is managed by the Institute of Systematic Botany at the University of South Florida. And so this is an example of a specific page at the Atlas of Florida Plants, and you can see that there is a row that says status that indicates whether that species is native or not, as well as a map showing all the counties for which herbarium specimens have been collected for that particular species. Now, for those of you from Louisiana, I'm not sure if there is actually a Louisiana plant atlas. I don't think there is. I know that Alabama and Georgia have developed atlases modeled after the Florida Plant Atlas, but I don't know that Louisiana has one yet. But for those of us in Florida, we're very fortunate to have this centralized resource that we can use to check on plant scientific names, what families they're currently placed in, what the common name is, whether they're native or not, and what their distribution within the state of Florida is. So a great resource, the Atlas of Florida Plants. Another more recent resource is the Flora of the Southeastern U.S., which was developed by Alan Weekly and his colleagues at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, which is at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I really like this resource because it gives you a regional view of the distribution of species. And it's a really nice format where in a single page, they're going to give you the scientific name, the common name, a little bit about when it flowers and what type of habitat it's in, its distribution, whether it's native or not, and then some information about the nomenclature, some synonyms and other names, and then a distribution map. And what I really like about the distribution maps is they use this set of symbols, which can initially be a little daunting because there's so many of them, but it gives us more nuance to understanding the distribution of a particular species across the southeastern region. So what you'll notice is that the fully black symbols are things that are common. The ones that have a white center are rare, and the ones with the dots in the middle are relatively uncommon. And then squares are native. Diamonds indicate that a species may be exotic, and triangle indicates it is exotic. So as an example, let's look at the eastern purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. Now, this is a species that in Florida is often featured, highlighted as a native Florida species. But looking at the distribution map from the Atlas of Florida Plants in the upper right corner, you can see that there's only one county in the state of Florida, Gadsden County, in the bluffs of the Chattahoochee River, where this particular species has been collected in the wild. Please go out. I'm having a webinar. Please.
You having a what now?
There is a webinar in progress. I have an audience of 200 people. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry for that interruption. Okay, so with purple coneflower, what I'd like you to pay attention to on this map is the areas that are dark, which is the areas where it is common, and squares, which is the native distribution for the eastern purple coneflower, is the northern part of Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois. So this is really an upland species. And as we move towards the Florida panhandle, this species becomes increasingly rare. And then as we move east towards the mid-Atlantic region, we're seeing more diamonds where there's the possibility that the species may be exotic or introduced, until we get all the way to the far east and northeast where it's clearly exotic. So this is indicating that this species, Echinacea, probably originated and evolved in the uplands of the Midwest to the upper Mid-South, and that it's been moved because Echinacea has been used for medicinal purposes, both by Native American people and also by colonial people. So there's a good possibility its distribution in the Southeast has expanded as the result of people moving it and planting it. Okay, so this is just one example of how this type of symbols in a distribution map can give you a little more nuance to understanding the native range for a species. Okay, so how do we know if this particular species is native? Botanists actually look at a number of different information sources, which I'm going to discuss separately. So we're going to run through each of these types of information sources. First are herbarium specimens. In case you're not aware of it, an herbarium is just like a library of preserved pressed specimens. Typically, they are dried, pressed flat, and then mounted on archival paper, and they're stored away in folders. So they're serving as a reference collection for botanists to study a whole bunch of different features related to plants. So on the left, you can see a pitcher plant, Sarracenia psittacina, that was collected here in Florida out on the Panhandle in 1843. And so with herbarium specimens and their usefulness for understanding nativeness, typically what you're doing is going to herbarium collections both within and outside of the state and looking for the earliest representations of this particular species. The idea being that if there are specimens collected from wild types of habitats in early times, then that should be a good indication that the species is native. And conversely, if there are not a lot of early specimens from undisturbed habitats, that may suggest that a species is not native. Now, one of the really nice things about herbarium specimens compared to some of the other lines of evidence that we're going to discuss later is that with a herbarium specimen, you can actually check up that it is identified correctly. That is, you can put it under a microscope and key it out and make sure that that specimen really is that particular species. Where in some of the other information sources where someone's just writing about it in a book, the species concepts may have changed over time, and you can't necessarily be sure that the individual is really talking about the same species that you're interested in. Now, another point of evidence for looking if the species is native in the region, in Florida or in the region, are early floras. Floras are just descriptions of publications that document all the plant species within a specific geographic area at that point in time. And so our earliest floras for the southeastern US include Michaud's Flora Borealis Americana, or Flora of North America. Michaud was a French botanist in the court of King Louis XVI, and he traveled extensively through eastern North America over a period of about several years, but he was really in Florida fairly briefly. So the things that Michaud has to offer in terms of Florida nativeness are fairly limited because he didn't cover the entire state and he didn't spend a lot of time here. Another flora that we can refer to is John Torrey and Asa Gray's Flora of North America, which they started in 1838, but never completely finished. And Torrey and Gray also just barely visited Florida. They came to Florida to see the species Torreya taxifolia in the Panhandle, but otherwise they never really collected in the state. So the things that this flora has to offer in terms of nativeness in the state of Florida is fairly limited. Now, this is in contrast to the Flora of the southern United States, which was published in 1897 by Alvin Wentworth Chapman. Chapman actually was a northerner who moved to Florida and lived on the Panhandle, and he collected extensively across the state throughout his adult lifetime. And so Chapman's flora is considered a really good representation of the kind of bird's eye view on the ground of what was present in the state at the time that he published it in 1897. Chapman was also a prolific correspondent, so he wrote letters and exchanged specimens with botanists across the eastern United States. And so he assembled information on plants that had been observed by others that he might not have necessarily seen himself. And then lastly, we have John Kunkel Small, who was at the New York Botanic Garden. He was the curator of botany at the New York Botanic Garden. Small was a correspondent of Chapman's, and then through Chapman's invitation, made a series of trips to the state of Florida over a number of years, collecting specimens in the state. And so Chapman's and Small's floras are our best resources for evaluating what plants were noted floristically in the state. Another type of evidence is early naturalist accounts. Now, these naturalist accounts differ from floras because they are not necessarily systematic lists of all the species that were observed, but instead are more informal accounts of where they went, what they observed. And so our best early naturalist accounts for Florida and the Southeast are Mark Catesby, who traveled in Florida, the Bahamas, and the Carolinas between 1722 and 1726. So this is considerably earlier than any of those floras I mentioned on the previous slide. Now, Mark Catesby drew illustrations of both animals and plants. There's more animals than plants represented, but still a valuable source of information on some species of plants that he encountered at this early point in the 18th century. And then, of course, there was William Bartram, who was a correspondent of Kate Spiess, first visited Florida with his father, John Bartram, in 1765 in the St. Johns River area, and then returned on his own in the 1770s, visited Amelia Island in Northeast Florida, traveled down the St. Johns River, and was at Paynes Prairie here in Alachua County. Now, Bartram's travels are rather sparsely illustrated, but they include valuable descriptions not only of plants, but of animals and indigenous people of the southeastern region. Then another line of evidence for determining if a species is native is whether it shows up in the paleontological or the archaeological record. So the difference between these two is that paleontology is fossilized or mineralized remains that predate humans being present. Whereas archaeological remains are those that are associated with human dwellings. So with both of these, the preservation is fairly random or fortuitous. It's not every plant that is going to be in conditions where it is necessarily going to be preserved. So it has to be a certain set of circumstances that lead to a plant specimen becoming mineralized in the fossil record or carbonized or waterlogged in an anaerobic environment in the archaeological record. So things like plant remains are much less common in the paleontological and archaeological records than things like animal bones, or in the archaeological record, things like stone tools or ceramics, which are hard and durable and readily preserved. So just remember that the paleontological and archaeological records are fairly spotty and biased, but when things do show up in those records, they can be a good indication of the possibility that something was present in our area at a very early time. Another way to get at distribution, to get at whether something is native or not, is looking at the distributional record for the species across an entire region. So the plant illustrated in the photo in the upper left is called tropical whiteweed or blue top. It's a species of Azuratum. And this is a species that is increasingly commonly observed in disturbed habitats in Florida. Now, when we look at the places where it's been found and considered to be native, that's Mexico primarily, and then that's the areas in green on this worldwide map. And then the areas that are purple are all the places that it's considered to be non-native and introduced. And so what you can see is that this species has an almost global pattern of being introduced or exotic across the tropics. So, and there is this disjunct between its native range in Florida in the southeast. So it's highly unlikely that this species, Azuratum conizoides, would be native in Florida. It makes more sense that just as it's been introduced in all these other areas with a tropical climate, it is also introduced here in Florida. Another thing to look at when assessing nativeness is habitat preferences. So native species are often found in undisturbed natural habitats, and they're often very habitat specific. So in this photo on this slide, you see wiregrass, which is traditionally found in pine lands that are subjected to burning. Whereas non-native plants are often found in more disturbed secondary habitats. That would include roadsides, pastures, fields, urban and suburban landscapes, vacant lots, and so on. So when we're talking about native status, I just want you to be aware that botanists are not always in agreement. Some resources may say that a certain species is native, while other reputable resources say it's exotic. The most robust ideas for whether something is native or not are those that look at multiple lines of evidence, like the ones that I mentioned on the preceding slide. And then opinions can change over time, especially as new evidence comes to light, or a particular botanist takes an interest in a particular species and does some digging. So let's look at some examples of some different species where the ideas of whether it's native or not have changed over time. So this is a species of morning glory called Alamo vine or Noyo vine. It's in the genus Meremia. It's Meremia dissecta, and is very common in disturbed sites, and it was long thought to be introduced in the state of Florida. But then in 2007, one of the specialists in the morning glory family, Dan Austin, studied this plant and its distribution, looked at herbarium records, and he noted that Bartram had observed this plant in 1774 and actually illustrated it. So we knew that Bartram was talking about the correct plant. And then it was also observed by Andre Michaud in Marion County in 1788. And its native distribution seems to be across the entire Caribbean region and the continental areas surrounding the Caribbean. So Austin came to the conclusion that even though previous people had thought the species was non-native, he argued it was native and published an article arguing that. And now most of the floras, like the Atlas of Florida plants and the flora of the Southeast, have changed, now indicating that the species is native. Another example that has caused a lot of consternation is the pinwheel flower, firewheel, or Indian blanket, Gaillardia pulchella. This has long been promoted as a native wildflower, and people love this plant because it's tough and undemanding in rather difficult circumstances. Now, what I want to point out is there's been some uncertainty on the status of the species, whether it's native or not, since the late 1800s. An article came out in 2020 published by Alan Weekly with a number of colleagues. And they argued that this species is really native to Mexico and the southwestern U.S., but is not native in the eastern U.S., including Florida. What they noted is there aren't early herbarium specimen records. It's not mentioned in early explorer accounts like Bartram or Michaud, and that this species was often confused in early floras like the Britain flora and the Michaud flora, who both mention it, because there's another closely related species, Gaillardia aestivalis. And so the idea is that they really were looking at aestivalis and thought they were seeing pulchella. So the conclusion that they came to, which you can see a little quote here from that article, is that this species is very likely introduced in the southeastern U.S. and is only native west of the Mississippi River. Now, here's another species that those of us in South Florida will be familiar with. Others may not be as familiar with. This is the autograph tree or pitch apple, which is native to the Caribbean, southern Mexico, northern South America. In Florida, it's cultivated all the way through the frost-free parts of the state, so up to the Tampa Bay region and Brevard, the Space Coast area. But the records indicate that this species is probably only confined to pine rockland habitats in the very southernmost part of the state of Florida. So that would be the Florida Keys and the southernmost part of Miami-Dade County. And what we're seeing with Clusia rosea is that its distribution has expanded over time as a result of human cultivation, but that its native status is probably in the state of Florida very limited to the southernmost part. And then another species that I've been interested in is a widespread plant that is often really appreciated for its pollinator benefits, which is the beggar ticks or Spanish needles, Bidens alba. This species is thought to be native to Mexico, Central America, Northern South America, but its status in the southeastern US and the Caribbean is uncertain. And then certainly it's been introduced in the Old World. Now, in Michaud's 1803 flora, he listed 2 other species of Bidens, but did not mention Bidens alba. The earliest herbarium specimens in Florida of this species are rather late. They're from the 1870s. And most of those specimens are from more disturbed habitats. For example, there's an 1879 specimen from Philadelphia that actually indicates on the herbarium specimen label that it was brought as ballast, that is, introduced through the soil that was in the hold of a ship. Now, there are multiple specimens from the 1840s to the 1860s of this species, Bidens alba, from locations where it was clearly not native, including Hawaii, the Canary Islands, Malaysia, Madagascar, and Australia. And that tells me that the species was going where the explorers were going. Often our explorers were traveling with animals, particularly livestock like cattle and horses. And because this species has fruit with these little pointed barbs on the tips, like you see in this photo, then they can very readily get attached to the legs or the feet of animals. And it's quite likely that this species moved along with early Spanish explorers. So that makes me think that this species is very likely introduced in Florida. We hardly ever see it in undisturbed natural habitats, but it's ubiquitous on disturbed ones. The status on this species is still up for debate. I believe the Atlas of Florida Plants still has it listed as native, but says that its nativity is questionable. And likewise, the flora of the southeastern US says it's possibly exotic or introduced. So there's a number of questions that people often ask about native plants, or some assumptions that they question. One of them is native plants easier to grow than non-native ones. And the answer to this would be sometimes. Some native plants can be very habitat specific, very restricted to a certain set of environmental conditions. For example, the sandhill laurel, Kalmia hirsuta, is only found in a specific set of habitat conditions and can be really hard to cultivate. Whereas some other native species are very forgiving in cultivated circumstances and can be very easy to grow. So on this question of whether native plants are easier to grow than non-native ones, sometimes. Are all native plants desirable garden subjects? Not necessarily. I'm going to show an example on the next slide that'll challenge that assumption that all native plants are great for gardening. Are all non-native plants invasive? No. Research has shown about 10 to 15% of non-native plants become many of non-native plants that are Florida friendly and okay to grow. Are native plants more drought tolerant? Sometimes. Native plants occur across the state of Florida in a variety of habitats. So obviously, those that are from more xeric types of habitats will be more drought tolerant, but native species that are from Florida wetland habitats aren't necessarily going to be more drought tolerant. So the thing is that we're not necessarily choosing plants for drought tolerance just because they're native, but we're selecting species from native xeric habitats to ensure that they're drought tolerant. What about buying native plants from nurseries outside of Florida, if you're a Florida gardener? Just be aware that there are different ecotypes in different parts of the southeastern region. So even though a species might be native in Florida and also out in Louisiana and up in the Carolinas, the ecotypes that occur outside of Florida may be genetically different from those that occur in Florida. So there is the potential to be introducing other gene pools and potentially contaminating the gene pool of our native species by buying things from outside of state. Now, here's an example of the second point, which was just two native species that aren't necessarily considered to be desirable garden subjects. So we have smilax, or the catbrier, and Virginia creeper, Parthenocissus, which are both fairly rampant vines, and I don't think most people will consider these to be great garden or landscape subjects. Now, we also have the question in nativars. Nativars are just cultivars that have been developed from native species. And what you should be aware of is that when we're talking about nativars, there are varying degrees of genetic alteration. Some are just things that were encountered in the wild as spontaneous mutations and have been perpetuated by cutting propagation. So those are probably things that are very close to the original native genetics with just a single mutation. And then you have other examples like this particular cultivar illustrated on this slide, the Salvia coccinea cultivar Summer Jewel Lavender, which is the result of fairly extensive breeding programs. So they took our native Salvia coccinea and crossed it with several other species to get a plant that was more compact, more floriferous, and had a different color. And so it's not that this cultivar, Summer Jewel Lavender, isn't a cool plant. It is, and it's worth growing. But would you necessarily want to plant it in a native plant demonstration garden? It's probably pretty far from the original native genetics of Salvia coccinea, so I would say no. There are plenty of improved nativars that have great garden performance, but are often heavily modified. So just be aware of that. And the bottom line is, if you're planting in a context where nativeness is really of concern, so that's adjacent to a natural area or in a landscape where you're specifically demonstrating native plants, you want to select nativars or cultivars that are very close to the wild types. Also be aware that we have outcrossing going on all the time between introduced species or subspecies and the ones that are native here to our state of Florida. Now, in this slide is an example, Hamelium patens, which is, there is a Florida native variety, and then there's one that's native to Mexico and Central America, which is widely cultivated because it's much more compact in habit. And what's happened over time is the native form of this species and the non-native form of this species have often been grown side by side in both nurseries and in landscapes. And as a result, we're getting seedling offspring that have a mix of the native and non-native genetics. So we are seeing a gradual dilution of the genetics of the native firebush and more introduction of attributes from the non-native. This is also happening with the beech dune sunflower, where we have 3 different varieties that occur in the state of Florida in different parts of the state, but as a result of them being planted and grown outside of their native zone, we're seeing a lot of mixing of the Panhandle, the West Coast, and the East Coast varieties. And so the conclusions that I'd like to present to you on nativeness is that for some Florida plants, the native status is really uncertain, that more and different types of data are needed to really understand if a particular species is native to the state or not. That we need to remember to be alert to our own biases or our assumptions about whether a particular plant is good or bad based on whether it's native or not. When it comes to purchasing native plants, we need to be aware consumers and actually ask our wholesale providers, our nurseries, what is the source of this plant? They may list a species as native, but you might say, hey, is this grown from material that is native here in Florida, or did you get seed or cutting from plants outside of the region? Be alert to regional limits and distribution within the state of Florida. So just because something is native to the southern part of the state doesn't mean it will necessarily perform well or be appropriate to grow in the central or northern part of the state. And then lastly, for success in cultivation, you really want to pay attention to habitat. That is, don't just grow something because it's native, but grow it because the growing conditions that you have are similar to the natural habitat for that species. There's lots of good resources on the internet for you to find out more about Florida native plants. That includes Ask IFAS, some publications from the EDIS document website, the Florida Native Plant Society, and the Florida Wildflower Foundation. There's some great field guides, habitat and ecological guides, and gardener guides that are on here. I will make sure that Mark and his colleagues have this presentation available in PDF format so they can share it with all of you if you want to find out more. And with that, I will be happy to entertain any questions. I know I've gone over, so if there is time, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Mark, for a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
And just to remind everyone, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our FFL website within 2 weeks' time of today's session. But for now, Mark, we have roughly about eight minutes to address questions. So we are going to start with the first one. Considering hybridized plants, that are created by humans. Are there any native hybridized plants that you're aware of?
Sure. So we can have different genetics in different parts of the state of things that are native. Beech dune sunflower would be an example, right? Where we have panhandle populations, West Coast populations, and East Coast populations. So you can have plants that are hybridized using parent material that is native. So you can't necessarily assume that all hybrids are non-native, but getting back to that original definition from that federal committee where it's saying unaltered by humans, as soon as we start getting humans making crosses, that kind of crosses the line where you might like say, okay, something's native or, and it just depends on the context where you decide whether it's really native or not.
Thank you.
Next,
Thank you so much, Mark. The next question we have. Not all natives are considered good, but do have a purpose in our ecosystem. Some can be very aggressive or not appropriate in our gardens. Do you agree with this statement?
I agree with the statement completely, Diane. What I will say is that there's not a lot of question that native species have evolved in Florida or in the region in concert with other species, so those other species have developed dependencies in terms of pollination, that there's all types of benefits to the native species. I think sometimes we give short shrift to the ecosystem services of non-native species. And I think it would be interesting to do some blind studies with certain plants where you don't let the data collectors know whether that species is native or not, but just have them collect data and see, are the non-native things being visited by pollinators? Are they providing shelter to wildlife? Are they providing food? Are they helping to remove toxins from soil? Are they providing hydrology benefits and so on? Next question.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Jennifer. Does the Florida Plant Atlas state a species ecosystem?
That is a great question, Jennifer. The Atlas does not provide an ecosystem. Ecosystem setting. What I will say is there's a printed companion to the Plant Atlas, which is the Guide to the Vascular Plants of Florida. It does list the habitats where the species is commonly found. The flora of the southeastern US from UNC Chapel Hill does provide ecosystem or habitat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The next one is from Brian. He's wanting to know if you can give us a little bit more information on ISA credits.
Oh, that's for you.
Right. Oh yes, yes. So this is actually covered under the CEUs. Sorry about that. I misunderstood the question. The next one we have here is from Diane again. Do you think it's important to use natives for some of our native pollinators?
So absolutely. I think there are some very specific relationships between some of our native pollinators and certain species of plants where there is a total dependence. So it's absolutely important that we maintain the wild habitats for those native species, but also when those native pollinators are threatened or endangered, that we're also cultivating those native plants to create more sources of pollen for those native pollinators. Now, on the other hand, there are some pollinators that are generalist, right? And so with the generalist pollinators that visit many different species, they may not necessarily show a preference for native versus non-native. Now, sometimes there can be a problem because, for example, with the milkweeds and our monarch butterflies, they will visit a number of different species of milkweeds, but with our native species that they typically visit, stop flowering and go to seed in time for the monarchs to make their migration down to Mexico, where the non-native milkweeds, particularly the tropical milkweed, tends to bloom later in the season. So the monarchs hang out longer and they may not make their migration to escape before the cold. So there are potential problems that can happen with the pollinators when we're not mindful of what we're growing in terms of native versus non-native.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Frank. And that takes us to the end of our webinar session today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. We do have quite a few questions that we didn't get a chance to cover. However, Mark, with your permission, is it safe or is it okay to share your email with the rest of the participants present here today?
Absolutely. I get a lot of questions each day, so I may be a little slow in responding, but feel free to reach out to me if there are specific questions that I can help with.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your willingness. So
You're welcome.
with that being said, thank you everyone so much for your time. And thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. It was very, very informative. Again, Rebecca clarified that the session today will be posted within a week. So maybe by the end of this week on Friday, it will be posted on our website. So for your convenience, please feel free to review these resources and review this professional webinar at your leisure. So if you don't have any questions, thank you again so much for being here. Everyone take care and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rebecca.
Take care.